In the dry fields of a small Texas town, far away from city lights and busy highways, lived a rancher named Thomas Blake. He was a tall man with weathered hands, sunburned skin, and eyes that carried the weight of years spent under the open sky. Every morning before the first light of dawn, he saddled his horse and rode through the vast land he owned, land that once belonged to his father and grandfather. To him, the ranch was not just soil and fences. It was memory, duty, and survival. Thomas had always been a man of few words. He lived alone since his wife passed away 5 years ago. The silence around the ranch had grown thick over time. The sounds of the cattle, the rustle of dry grass, and the wind brushing against the barn were his only companions. Though people in town respected him, few truly knew him. They said he worked too hard, spoke too little, and kept his heart locked away like a room no one entered anymore. One spring evening, as he was returning from the market, Thomas noticed a small house at the edge of his land. It had been empty for years, but now smoke rose from the chimney, and the faint scent of food drifted through the air. Curious, he rode closer and saw a woman tending to a small garden behind the house. She was new to the town, a widow named Mei Lin who had come from China with her late husband many years ago. After her husband's death, she had decided to live quietly, away from the noise of the city, hoping the countryside would give her peace. Thomas greeted her politely. She smiled shyly, her English soft but clear. There was a quiet grace about her, the way she moved, the way she listened before speaking. Over the weeks that followed, Thomas often passed by her house on his way to check the fences. Sometimes she would wave, sometimes she would offer him tea. Their conversations were simple at first, about the weather, the crops, or the stray cattle that wandered near her garden. But little by little, something began to change in Thomas. He found himself thinking about her smile while working. He began to look forward to those short visits, even planning his route so that he could pass by her home more often. It was strange for him. For years, he had kept his emotions buried deep, certain that the part of him capable of warmth had died along with his wife. Yet with Mei Lin, that part of him began to wake again, slowly, carefully, like the first green shoot after a long winter. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled across the plains. Heavy rain poured, and lightning flashed across the dark sky. Thomas rode through the storm, trying to get his cattle to safety. By the time he reached his barn, he was soaked and exhausted. Then he remembered Mei Lin's small house near the creek, a place that could easily flood. Without thinking twice, he turned his horse and rode toward it. When he arrived, the water had already reached the steps. Mei Lin stood at the door, frightened but calm. He shouted over the rain, telling her they needed to leave. She hesitated, saying she didn't want to abandon her home, but Thomas insisted. The wind was strong, the rain unforgiving. Finally, she nodded and took his hand. Together, they rode back through the storm, clinging to each other as thunder roared above. They reached his ranch safely, and Thomas helped her inside. She was trembling from the cold, and he quickly lit a fire. The small room filled with warmth and the soft crackle of burning wood. Mei Lin thanked him quietly, her voice shaking. Thomas handed her a blanket and sat across from her, the firelight dancing between them. Neither spoke for a long time. The storm outside was loud, but inside the silence felt peaceful, almost comforting. As the hours passed, they talked. She told him about her late husband, about her years in China, about how hard it was to start over in a place where everything felt different. Thomas listened, truly listened, something he hadn't done in years. When he spoke, he told her about his wife, about the loneliness that crept in after she was gone, and about how he never thought he'd care about anyone again. There was no judgment, no pity, just understanding. The night went on, and the storm slowly faded. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Thomas looked at Mei Lin and realized how much strength she carried in her quietness. He admired the way she faced life, not with loud defiance, but with calm courage. She too saw something in him, a man hardened by loss, but still kind enough to care. In the days that followed, Mei Lin stayed at the ranch until the floodwaters receded. They worked together, fixing fences, feeding the animals, and repairing the garden that the storm had damaged. Every shared task brought them closer. The townsfolk began to notice that Thomas was smiling again, something they hadn't seen in years. One evening after a long day of work, Thomas and Mei Lin sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of gold and rose. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with things unspoken yet understood. Thomas turned to her and said softly, "It's been a long time since this place felt alive." Maylin smiled and replied, "Maybe it just needed two lonely hearts to meet." Thomas laughed, a sound so rare that even he was surprised by it. That night he lay awake thinking about her words. For the first time in many years he felt something like peace settling inside him. It wasn't the restless ache of loss or the heavy quiet of solitude. It was the gentle warmth of companionship, something fragile but real. He knew life on the ranch would always be hard. There would be storms, droughts, and long days of labor. But now the world didn't feel quite so empty. Maylin's laughter echoed in his mind, and her presence had become a soft light in the dim corners of his days. The story of the rancher and the widow soon became one that people in town whispered about, not as gossip, but as a tale of hope. They said the old rancher had changed, that his heart had found its way back from the shadows. Some even said that love, no matter how late it arrives, always finds those who still have room to care. As the season turned and the fields bloomed again, Thomas and Maylin continued to work side by side. He would teach her how to ride a horse, and she would teach him how to grow vegetables in neat rows. Their days were filled with simple tasks, shared laughter, and the quiet comfort of knowing they were no longer alone. And though neither of them spoke of love directly, it was there, in the way Thomas would wait for her at the gate every morning, and in the way she would leave a cup of tea on the porch for him each night. Theirs was not a love born of passion or haste, but of kindness, patience, and healing. It was a love that grew like the land itself, slowly, steadily under the wide, forgiving sky. When summer came to the ranch, the days grew longer and brighter. The grass turned golden, and the wind carried the sweet smell of hay through the fields. Thomas and Maylin had now spent many months working side by side. Every morning she would walk from her small house near the creek to the ranch, wearing her straw hat and carrying a basket of vegetables she had grown. Thomas would already be up, waiting by the barn with 2 mugs of coffee. He had started to smile more, and his voice had softened from the rough tone it once carried. The town folks often spoke about the two of them. Some said it was surprising that a rancher like Thomas, who had once been so quiet and distant, now spent so much time with the gentle widow from across the field. Others admired their friendship, saying that maybe the two had saved each other in their own way. But Thomas and Maylin didn't care much for gossip. They had found a rhythm to their days, one filled with simple joys and quiet understanding. Thomas began teaching Maylin how to ride horses. At first she was nervous, gripping the saddle too tightly, afraid the horse might run too fast. But Thomas was patient. He would walk beside her, holding the reins gently, speaking in a calm voice. "Don't fight the horse," he'd tell her. "Just move with it. Trust it like you trust yourself." Slowly she learned. One morning, she surprised him by riding across the field alone, her laughter echoing in the wind. He smiled wider than he had in years. In return, Maylin taught Thomas how to grow vegetables and herbs properly. She had a gift for gardening, and her small patch of land turned green and full of life. "The earth listens," she often said. "You just have to give it kindness." Thomas helped her build a small greenhouse beside the barn, and soon they were growing tomatoes, beans, and peppers. It gave them both something to care for, something living that responded to patience and love. As time passed, the bond between them grew stronger. They shared meals in the evenings, sometimes talking for hours about their past lives. Maylin spoke about her childhood in China, the mountains, the markets, the music her mother used to play on a bamboo flute. Thomas listened, fascinated by the world she described. In return, he told her stories of his youth, how his father taught him to rope cattle, how he once got lost in a storm and found his way home by following the North Star. Their connection was not built on grand gestures, but on quiet companionship. There were moments when they didn't need words at all. Just sitting together on the porch watching the sunset was enough. The sky would turn deep orange and the shadows of the hills would stretch long and soft across the land. Sometimes Thomas would glance at Maylin and feel a warmth inside his chest, not the fire of youth, but the deep, steady glow of peace. Then came autumn, and with it, the season of harvest. The ranch was busy again. The cattle were rounded up and workers came to help with the hay. Maylin cooked for everyone, filling the kitchen with the smell of stew and baked bread. Her laughter filled the air and the men respected her kindness. Thomas watched her move through the house, offering food and comfort to everyone, and realized how much life she had brought back into his world. But as often happens in life, peace does not stay forever. One afternoon, while riding out to check the fence near the far edge of his land, Thomas fell from his horse. His foot caught in the stirrup and he was dragged a short distance before the horse stopped. He managed to free himself, but his leg was badly injured. Somehow he got back on the horse and rode home, barely conscious. When Maylene saw him, she rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she helped him off the horse. She cleaned the wound and wrapped it carefully, whispering prayers under her breath. For days she stayed by his bed, refusing to leave until he was out of danger. The ranch hands offered to help, but she insisted on doing everything herself, cooking his meals, checking his bandages, even reading aloud to him when the nights grew long. During those quiet days of recovery, something changed between them. Thomas had always been strong, always the one who helped others. But now he had to depend on someone else. At first it made him uneasy, but as he watched Maylene's calm and gentle care, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. She never complained, never showed tiredness. Sometimes when he couldn't sleep, he'd wake to find her dozing in the chair beside him, a book open in her lap. When he finally healed enough to walk again, Thomas felt a new kind of courage inside him, the courage to speak what his heart had kept quiet for so long. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, he asked Maylene to sit with him on the porch. The air was cool and the first stars were beginning to appear. He looked at her for a long time before speaking. "You've done more for me than anyone has in years," he said softly. "You brought life back to this place, and to me." Maylene smiled gently, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "You gave me a home when I had none," she replied. "You showed me kindness when I felt lost. Maybe we both needed to be found." For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the crickets and the wind moving through the grass. Then Thomas reached out and took her hand. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. "I don't know what the future holds, but I'd like to share it with you. Here on this land, in this life." Maylene's eyes filled with quiet tears, but her smile was steady. "Yes," she whispered. "We will build our days together." From that day forward, Maylene never returned to her old house by the creek. She moved into the ranch house, and together, they turned it into a home full of warmth and light. They repaired old walls, painted rooms, and filled the shelves with books and photographs. The place that had once echoed with silence now rang with laughter and the smell of home-cooked meals. Years passed gently. The ranch prospered under their care. Children from nearby families would come to play in the fields, and Maylene would teach them how to plant seeds. Thomas would tell stories about the stars and the old days of cattle drives. They became something of legends in their small town, not because of wealth or fame, but because of the kindness they showed to everyone who crossed their path. One winter night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas turned to Maylene and said, "You know, I used to think my life was over when I lost my wife. But I was wrong. Life doesn't end when we lose someone we love. It just waits for us to begin again." Maylene nodded, placing her hand on his. "The heart doesn't forget pain," she said softly, "but it learns how to make room for joy again." And so, the rancher who once believed he couldn't control his loneliness learned that love doesn't need to be wild or sudden to be real. It can grow slowly, quietly, between two people who simply refuse to give up on life. When spring came once more, the fields were green again. Thomas and Maylene stood together at the fence line, watching the sunrise spread across the sky. The land stretched wide and endless before them, a promise of new beginnings and a reminder that sometimes the heart's greatest strength is not in holding on, but in learning to open itself again.